Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Thinking Theologically podcast, a show where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I am your rightful, normal host, Jack Dodgen, joined as always by, getting to say it again, the Master Resident Theologian in Training, Spencer Shaw. Spencer, how you doing?
I'm doing good. This is our normal format, so we're on episode 76. Which I find it kind of hard to believe. We're getting close to episode 100 and not too long, I guess. But it's kind of hard to believe that we've had this many episodes. But this is our normal format, but it feels weird because we haven't been in it for so long. We've been doing the spiritual realm stuff, which is kind of your area of expertise, and so we flipped for a while, and I kind of got used to because I was hosting with you, and we've had some guests in the middle of all that I've hosted as well, so it kind of feels weird to be back on this end of things, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess it'll be even a little more. This isn't a normal episode either. Like, we're doing a whole different thing this month, and so while I'm starting us off, there's going to be a little bit more like back and forth, I think, of stuff that we're excited to share this month with everyone about politics. It's just a whole month about politics. We during COVID, you had invited me to come to do summer series stuff through video. And this year you thought, well, why don't we just do that again? Instead of bringing me all the way down to Houston. Is it Houston area? Is that a good...
Yeah, we're a couple hours east, Beaumont. We're pretty close to the... We're not that far from Houston, but we're a lot closer to the Louisiana border than Houston. So
But instead of flying me all the way down there, having me drive all the way down there and putting me up or whatever, just like, hey, can you record a couple videos and I'll do the other couple lessons. And you did a summer series on thinking theologically about politics, and then said, hey, let's do this for the website as well. So this is what October is, where we're going to have all kinds of stuff that we want to lead into with this particular episode of here's what to expect. We've teased it on the most recent episodes, but we wanted to spend a little bit of time just laying out like what to expect this month, what kind of stuff to see. We already changed our little Facebook header, and we're really jumping into all the political stuff right before voting and chaos or whatever takes place. Who knows? It's always...
That's assuming that chaos has not already taken place, which
true.
I think it might have. So we might be jumping into the middle of the chaos.
Yes, we are yelling in the chaos a little bit, and hopefully what we have to say is valuable. So, goodness, I don't have the host voice. It almost gave out on me. Want to remind you all to check out thinkingtheologically.org, where these episodes, 4 of which, well, actually, they're all video now because of this, but several of them are going to be not normal podcast episodes, but the lessons we did that are there on video, as well as more than likely some written content from Spencer as potentially as well as myself, which I enjoy writing. It just takes me forever because I write a lot of things and don't know what to cut. So, but we'll have some additional written things. All of that stuff will be on the website, and also make sure that you have liked the Facebook page, Thinking Theologically, so that you can get those updates when those things go up. Can share those with some other people as well. And we're all over the place on social media, and by we, I mean I'm on Facebook, and through Spencer as my proxy, I am also in these other places because he'll let me know what criticisms come through at the very least, and hoard the compliments for himself.
Yes.
So, with all of that stuff out of the way here, what's the goal, Spencer? We'll start with that, of why we're even doing any of this, and what are we trying to accomplish with the politics stuff this month?
Yeah, so we're calling this episode, and probably the way that I'll organize everything on the website, it'll be a series that will probably call the whole thing Thinking Theologically About Politics. And that's not just because the name of our podcast slash blog slash publishing company, I guess now. I don't really know what we are at this point in time, but whatever we are, it's not just because we're called Thinking Theologically, but because we think that it is important to think theologically about our beliefs as Christians. And that is, you can go
Yeah.
back to episode 1, we kind of talked about this. There's systematic theology, there's biblical theology. So there's more than one way to think theologically. And we do a little bit of all of that on this podcast. But the importance of that, as opposed to something like just cherry picking verses here and there to throw something together, or even worse, as we might think about politics, getting our information about how we are to think about politics from social media, from the news, from even politicians, that we want to think theologically about who we are as followers of Jesus. And so the goal of this series, and everything that we're going to be doing as a part of it, from this podcast episode to the individual content to the interview that we have to the articles that we're going to have coming out, is to try and present a theology of how followers of Jesus should think about and interact with politics. That is, politics is a natural part of our world. So our English word politics derives from the Greek word polis, which simply means city. And the idea of politics is kind of the organization, the structure, the hierarchy of the city. That is, when a group of people gather together, whoever that group of people is, whether it's a church, whether it's a city, whether it's a state, whether it's a country, or even the entire world as a group of people, when a group of people come together, they have a politic. There's a way that they're going to organize themselves. There's going to be a way that they make decisions. There's going to be things that the group does, or that members of the group are expected to do, and things that they are not to do and expected not to do, or forced not to do, or depending on the politics of that particular group. And so politics is something that we can't avoid as long as we live around other people. So unless we're going to go live on an island by ourselves, politics is going to be a part of our way of life in all the groups that we're a part of, really. But the way that we are to approach that is as followers of Jesus. That's who we are first and foremost, is image bearers of God, seeking to be transformed into the image of Jesus. And so that becomes the lens by which we think about, interact, and engage with the political forces that exist within our world. And so by providing a theology simply meaning the study of God, we want to allow God, we want to allow the image of God that we see most fully in Jesus. We want to allow the witness of God that is found in Scripture to inform how we as followers of Jesus should think about and interact with politics. And to me, that's the most important encouragement that I have for all Christians, is to engage in politics as a follower of Jesus. We're not going to always agree about what that looks like. And I know in one of the episodes, that solo episodes that I'm going to do, I talk about how we're not always going to agree what it looks like to engage in politics or this issue or that issue as a follower of Jesus. And the importance is not that we're always in agreement, but I think that we're doing so as followers of Jesus. That's what we're trying to do, is to engage as people trying to look like Jesus. And so since we're presenting a theology, so this is all about God, thinking about politics through the lens of God. What we're not going to address is what I call the 3 Ps: people, policies, and parties. We're not going to get into specifics about what people should you vote for or not vote for, what policies are good and
Mm.
not good, what party should you support or not support, but rather a theology, a foundational way of thinking, a lens through which you can look at people, policies, and parties and make a decision as a follower of Jesus that you think best fits with the theology. And so that's our goal, is to create that theology that can help us think about it, not just now, but hopefully throughout our lifetime. And I think that's the important thing about a theology, is a theology, though it's going to change as we grow and as we change and as we learn things, but
Hmm.
it's not going to change as much as the people, the policies, and the parties are going to change. And so the hope is that a foundational theology, as much as the political realm changes, will still be able to ground us in our faith. So that's the goal, or at least hopefully the goal. And
Yeah.
I guess I will add to that I think this is important because we can't forget that the political world exists. And so I'm of that balance of, for some people, politics is everything. And that's why we want to build a theology, because politics isn't everything. The kingdom of God is everything. But others just want to pretend like politics doesn't exist, or that as Christians or the church, we shouldn't talk about politics. There's plenty of people that hate politics. I probably fall a little under that boat of I can't stand politics in general, but we can't act like it doesn't exist. And so
Yeah.
we have to address it and find a balance as followers of Jesus. So that's going to be the goal over the course of this month and all the different things that we're putting out.
Yeah. Just stopping and thinking about this stuff at all is more than some do. It can get very, very easy with the politics thing to go, I don't have time to evaluate each and every policy or each and every this, that, or the other nuance of this person's position is, and this is how they plan to solve the. Um, and so it can be very easy with, I guess, information overload. Goodness, as I was so used to just talking that now,
It seems like you're about to
if I
die.
pause,
Um,
uh, or maybe I'm not supposed to say this. I don't know. It can be very easy with all the information to fall into kind of the this is how I vote always. Well, this is how I vote always. And then, like you said, using the lenses of these three P's of I'm going to approach everything through this individual, or I'm going to approach everything through this party, or this policy is the one that's going to be the lens through which so I'm going to ignore these things and be okay with maybe this stuff, whatever, because this policy is how I'm viewing this whole thing. Okay, we want to pull back a little bit from all of that and say we have to make sure that as Christians we're behaving as Christians and thinking through things as Christians. And that's not to say that you can't talk about the three P's and not that makes you not a Christian. But you can certainly do that in non-Christian ways. We want to pull that back and go, okay, how do we take our Christian worldview? How do we take this responsibility of image bearing and view all of these things, discuss all of these things, interact with these others who are part of our city, part of the group that we're trying to work with here, who may very well be on the actual other side of wanting no part of bearing God's image and being on the other end of those things. We've got to interact with that extreme and everybody in between, and it can be very hard. It is very hard to balance all of that stuff out. So hopefully this is just a reminder of our overall goal is to bear God's image. How do we interact with politics with that overall goal in mind? Go
and
ahead, Spencer.
I'll add to that real quick that we dive into this in the conversation episode that we have this month. So I'll just
Mm.
briefly mention it, but that a theological approach to politics is not a balancing approach. It's not an approach that tries to balance the policies of the Democratic platform with the Republican platform. The kingdom of God is not a middle ground in politics. It is completely outside of the political system and looks upon the political system and has things to say and to critique and to compliment about human politics. And so in developing a theology, to Jack's point, and pulling back, is you have to pull back in order to view from the kingdom of God, because the kingdom of God is not something that exists within human political systems. It is something that is other than human politics.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, looks on and critiques and maybe even sometimes has something positive to say about human politics, though that might be a little bit more rare than the critiques that the kingdom might have. But nevertheless, that's the goal of thinking theologically, thinking from our standpoint in the kingdom about political related issues. We have to get outside of our human political systems and think about God first before we can then engage with some of these things that are going on in our world.
Yeah. So from that standpoint, we want to lay out here a little bit of what we believe generally about politics, and have a little bit of discussion about those things, just overall of what we believe when it comes to political power and Christians and their interaction with all of those things. So we've got, it's a list of about 4 things here, and Spencer will go through, and I'm sure I'll interject at various places, especially with this first one here. Spencer, what do we believe about politics and how Christians ought to interact with them?
Before I dive into it, I want to say the reason that I think it's important for us to kind of lay out where we're coming from is, if you've listened to episodes that we've done before when we've developed a theology, you've heard me say that you never develop a theology from a completely neutral or blank place, that you're always coming from somewhere. You have some preconceived ideas, some ways of thinking. There's things that you have seen, and there's things that you have experienced that help to influence the theology that you then create, the way that you think about God, the way that you read the Bible, what you see in Jesus, and so on and so forth. And so by laying out some of the things that we believe, with the goal is to kind of let you know our starting point for developing this theology, kind of where we're coming from, it's really trying to be open and honest with, these are some of our preconceived ideas. And so in very much, these will be kind of the lenses through which we'll think about some of the concepts and some of the texts that we'll talk about throughout this series, and that there's nothing wrong with that as long as we know, hey, this is where we're coming from. And there might be some critiques of where we're coming from, and that's perfectly fine. No two people are going to come from exactly the same place. But nevertheless, you could, I think, sum up everything that we believe by saying that we believe that Christians need to be cautious when engaging with political powers. So that the approach of Christians is a cautious one. What that means is it's not we don't engage at all, though I think that's an option. I'm not sure it's the best option. I talk about that in the first solo one that I do. David Lipscomb was one who promoted not engaging with the politics and government of the world. I'm not sure that we need to go that far and completely not engage. But also, I don't think that we should necessarily even desire to engage, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Our primary way of engaging the brokenness of the world should not be through political powers. I'm not sure we should want political power. I'm not convinced that that should be our primary focus. And so somewhere in the middle is kind of where both Jack and I are coming from. And so I would call it a cautious approach. We want to be cautious with it, that we can engage, that we can approach politics and political powers, but we do so cautiously, not blindly, not in a way where that becomes our primary focus and means of engaging with the evil and the powers that exist in the world. And the rest of these beliefs, I think, kind of support that. So why do we think that Christians need to be cautious when engaging political powers? And to me, and I'll let Jack speak on this as well, but for me, it's because I do believe that absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't think that's just like a little proverb that we just throw around and make jokes with, but I actually believe that that is true. From the things that I have seen and from the history that I am familiar with, it seems to me that I don't like speaking in absolutes, but this might be one of the things that I can say with 100% certainty, other than Jesus, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. That it is impossible to gain power, to get in bed with power and not have it affect you negatively in some way. And now, I don't think that means that everybody who has power does evil and horrible and horrendous things. I think everybody who's in power makes mistakes. And I think that people who are in power have to be much, much, much more careful about the way that they use that power, about abuses of power, about the temptations that come with that power. And so it corrupts, in not that you become this horribly corrupt person, but it does change you in certain ways. It does add to stress and temptation and those kind of things, which is why this is just a side note, but I'll plug my book really quickly. In the last chapter of my book, I talk about church leadership, and one of the things that I mention is that I think that ministers and eldership are, if you wanted to talk about power, which I don't like talking about power in the church, but if you wanted to talk about power, I argue that they're kind of on equal footing, that they work together, but it kind of becomes, if you want to compare to like the U.S. government, it kind of becomes the checks and balances, that an eldership is a plurality because of that. You don't have one person with all the power. But I think in too many churches, the eldership has unchecked power. And I think the balance to that ought to be the minister, and I think the check on the minister's power ought to be the elders. And I think the reason is because of this point of, even in the church, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That if you have one person, one elder, one minister, or even one group of people, so an eldership that's made up of 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever people, it's eventually, without any checks and balances, that person or that group will eventually become corrupted with power. That they will in some way abuse that power. And I'm not saying they do that intentionally, and I'm not saying that they become horrible, corrupted people. I'm not saying they don't realize that and change and repent of that. That's not what I'm saying. But at some point, there's going to be abuse of power. And in my opinion, the only way to prevent that is you have to have some kind of checks and balances for that power, even in the church. And I've seen that happen firsthand, of elderships that got to do whatever they wanted unchecked and becoming corrupted in some ways. And I don't throw around that term lightly, but I think that even within Christian circles, we see absolute power corrupting absolutely. And there's a couple of examples real quick that I want to give. To me, the biggest example is the violence in Europe once Christians gained power. So Christians were the oppressed group early on in their history in the Roman Empire. Constantine becomes a quote unquote Christian. I'm not sure how we would define them.
Sure.
That's a bit questionable. But Christianity becomes the national religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine. And once Christians gain power, look through the rest of the history of the West, and it is filled with violence perpetuated generally by Christians. So you think of the Crusades, Christians perpetuating violence against Muslims, so against another religion. But then you see violence within Christianity. So a lot of the history of the West is Protestants killing Catholics, Catholics killing Protestants. So after the Protestant Reformation, you see this again because the question that begins to change because of who's sitting on the throne. So who's the king, who's the queen? If they're a Protestant, they're going to seek to suppress Catholics. If they're Catholic, they're going to seek to oppress Protestants. Even before that, when you have the rise in the Catholic Church of the Pope, you see struggles of power between the Pope and the king or the queen of who is in power. Is it the Pope or is it the king? And there is a ton of amazing stories because if the theology of Catholicism is that salvation is found in the church. And so if the Pope can kick you out of the church, he can take away your salvation, which seems to give the Pope the power over the king. But if you know anything about kings, kings don't like to be subservient to anyone. And so you have this battle between, well, who has more power? Is it the Pope or is it the king? And I say that to say the history of the West is a struggle by Christians for power, and a lot of innocent people get harmed or even killed in the process, which seems to illustrate the point that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even for Christians, we are not exempt from that. I think that power magnifies our shortcomings. Jack and I were talking about some examples before the episode, and something that came to my mind was the story of Saul and David, these two kings that they're presented as good people, particularly David, before he actually rises to power. So you think about that there's a struggle for power between Saul and David because God has rejected Saul and chosen David. And so there's this struggle for power. And David responds to that in very good ways. So you think of when Saul was in the cave relieving himself and David could have killed him and he didn't. So you see the character of David in this power struggle. But once David takes power, you probably know the rest of the story. He does some good things, but he does a lot of pretty terrible things. And the reason I think in David is it's not that perhaps David had some of these shortcomings, struggles, temptations, whatever you want to call them, before he became king. But what the power does is it magnifies those because now you have the power to do something with it. So you think of the story of Bathsheba. Now that he's king, he has the power to take Bathsheba. Bathsheba doesn't get a choice in that. He has the power to kill Uriah. He has the power to capitalize on some of these temptations that he may have had beforehand. And so David becomes an example of absolute power corrupting absolutely. That not that all of a person is corrupted, but that people are always in one way or another corrupted by power. And if that's the case, and we as Christians are going to engage with the political powers, which I'm not sure we have much of a choice to, we have to be cautious that we aren't corrupted. There's I want to say it's in Jude, where it talks about pulling people out of the fire and not getting burned up yourself or something like that. The idea, this is similar to that. We're not talking about pulling people out of the fire, but we're talking about engaging with the fire of power without getting burnt ourselves. So you have to be cautious.
Yeah, a couple things to throw out with that as far as the being cautious and power and all this. So You made the point about the fighting and all of this, and said, a lot of innocent people, get caught up in the middle of that. Well, that's part of the caution, and we might look at this and go, well, but we're not really engaging in war. If it is war, it's war of words and things like that. Okay, fine. But one of the things that we have to be cautious about when engaging in stuff, even if it's just social media reactions or uh, the attitude through which we engage in these things, there are some innocent people along the way that could become very harmed. Our ability to bear God's image to other individuals, maybe specifically, could be very harmed. We need to be cautious about how we discuss these things. It doesn't mean we don't, but we need to be very careful about how we go about that because of the witness damage that could be done as we're engaging with these things. But then there's this too, um, with the power corruption stuff. There's some are going to be corrupted in the pursuit of power, like they want what it has to offer or what they think it has to offer, and will do things to gain that power. Others will find themselves in that position, and I think this is true with David, where um, maybe he has these kinds of struggles before anyway, but this stuff gets magnified, and he has, as you said, the power to now exercise, do these different things, to go take this, to go do this thing. I would say he also has the opportunity to do those things that maybe he didn't have before, as well. Where if he's not at the top of the temple, or not the temple, but if he's not in his palace there seeing Bathsheba, then maybe there isn't this issue with him ever going and taking somebody else. But there's an opportunity there, which is what a lot of people will argue in the pursuit of power. Of if we can get here, then we'll have the opportunity to do so much good. Yeah, you're also going to have the opportunity to do a lot of bad, because those doors are going to open to you too. Of you sure would hate to lose this power, wouldn't you? And sometimes it's the gaining of it that corrupts. Sometimes it's the having it that corrupts because of what doors are open. Sometimes it's the desire to not lose but keep the power that leads to corruption. So there's a lot of things that you don't consider until you get in some kind of position of power, and then you go, "Wow, I didn't know." I didn't know that this would be available to me over here. And how often do we see in any measure of power, within maybe bigger churches and things like that? Oh, this person had some kind of affair, or had some kind of interaction that they weren't supposed to, or were taking money, and but they felt like nobody's going to know. I have the power to do these things. I have the power to keep people quiet. We're seeing a lot of that right now, in Hollywood, in religious circles, in political circles. There's all kinds of stuff there. Whether they were like that or not before, or had the opportunity to do that stuff before, it all gets magnified. And one last point before we go on, you mentioned the elder minister thing. I think for people who of keeping in check and balance, I think there's good backing for that from an Old Testament standpoint, of the prophet, priest, and king triangle, where all three of those parties have some overlap, because ultimately we as Christians are to fulfill all three of those roles, but that's a different discussion. There's overlap in those positions, to some degree, but they also have distinct things that they're supposed to do. But all of them point the people to God, which is what the minister does. It's what the elders are to do. That's ultimately what's being done. But you go read through and you find, oh, we have a corrupt king. When David does his, when he encounters this shortcoming and leans into that, it's a prophet who says, you need to get back in line. And he does. But sometimes you have prophets that have gone off the rails, and it's another prophet that comes in to say, no, this is what God's saying. Don't listen to these people. Or you have a king that'll eliminate those prophets and say, you guys aren't doing your job, get out of here. Or you'll have priests that aren't doing theirs, and so they need to, but there's a check and balance there, because we all need to be doing our job to leading the people to God. And that's worth That's worth maybe its own episode on leadership and
Yeah,
accountability and
we
stuff. But
we might have to do that at some point, because that's the problem, I think, with the way that we in the modern world think of ministers as employees of the church, which is interesting that we as church consider them that way, but the government doesn't. The government actually has a more theologically correct view of ministers as like private contractors. Like that's how
yeah,
we pay taxes,
yep.
right? We're not as W-2 employees, which is more correct, actually, theologically, is to think about ministers in that way. Because when you're an employee, it's, well, we don't agree with you, so we fire you. And you lose the checks and balances, because a minister can't check the elders if the minister to them is just an employee, that if he does so, they'll fire him. Um, Not that you can't ever fire a minister, but I put that under the same category as like leaving a church. You must have a very, very, very good reason for it, and it's only after the end of a very long process that
Mhm.
is even considered, which is kind of my approach to engaging in politics. It's only after the end of a very long
Yeah,
process. So there you go. We might have to come back to church leadership at some point in time.
yeah. But there's, I'm with you on much of what we said here. And if any of you have ever had like any measure of what you could call power or authority or something like that, or seen it maybe in people close to you, you can go like, and it can be stuff like, the HOA or head of this committee or something, and you go, wow, that power really went to their head. Like that's a phrase, it's a thing that we see even in, yes, an area of power, but maybe a small area of power that we would consider. It's a thing that happens when those doors open. Yeah, opportunity to do a lot of good here. Yeah, but there's also a lot of doors for bad that have
Mm.
now opened up, and it's really tempting because it'll maybe help you keep that power. At least it'll appear that way. But there's some unseen realm stuff to discuss there with all
Um,
that. That
it's it's it blows my mind what we're, I guess, forgetting about what the books that we read when we were in high school English, and what is not required in high school English anymore, which that's a different thing. But I I've thought that when we talked about, and we as Christians have been in the forefront of the book banning thing, and I'm like, read Fahrenheit 451. Is that the society that's what it's all about, is getting rid of, that's not what we want. I was like, I read that book in school. I'm sure a lot of people had to read that book in school. It was the whole point of don't do that. Um, Lord of the Flies is one of the books that's an example of what we as human beings are capable of. And there's plenty of books that you could talk about. What are human beings capable of when you put them in the right situation? And we're capable of horrible things. And the same is true with power. Like, what are we capable of? Well, you don't see it now, but you give us the power or you put us in the right situation, and you'll see that we're capable of all kinds of horrible things that we didn't think we'd ever do.
yeah,
And power is one of the situations that can draw. There's others, but that's one of
sure,
the, desperation is another one. You make somebody desperate enough, or you give somebody enough power, then they'll do all kinds of crazy things. Anyway, we've probably talked enough about power. Okay, so second reason why we as Christians need to be cautious when engaging with political powers is that I believe that when we are continuously forced to choose the lesser of two evils, we slowly lose our ability to identify evil. This isn't me saying that it's necessarily wrong to choose the lesser of two evils, though we don't have to. I think Jack's going to have an article about that maybe and dive into that a little bit more. But nevertheless, most of us recognize that when we vote, that neither candidate is a good image of Jesus or a good representative of the Christian faith. Now, there's exceptions to that. We don't all think that, but I think most of us realize that, and I think that's most definitely true, that when we vote, we don't have one candidate that is the perfect, or most of the
Mhm.
time even a good image of our faith.
Yeah.
And so when we vote, we're forced to choose the lesser of two evils. Both of these are evil. Both of these are a bad reflection of our faith. But nevertheless, one's going to become the leader, and we want to engage in the process of choosing that leader, though we don't have to. We'll talk about that in future articles and episodes and stuff like that. We don't have to choose to participate in that process of choosing. But many of us feel like that's something that we need to do, and that's perfectly fine. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to how we engage or whether or not we vote, but we choose to choose the lesser of two evils. And I think while we can do that, I would argue we still need to be cautious. So I wouldn't tell you you can't vote. I would definitely also not say that you have to vote, because the longer you choose the lesser of two evils, the lesser evil looks evil. That is, the longer you have to choose between two evil things, the harder it becomes to identify what evil looks like, because we have become so close to evil. So I guess you could say that when you become close to power, that presents problem, but when you stand too close to evil, that also presents problems,
Mhm.
because you slowly become comfortable with it. And what I see that in a lot of Christians, like you point out something that is evil, something that is bad, something that is wrong about a politician or a party, and I think this is true of both sides, and they don't see it. They find a way to rationalize, well, it's not really bad, or it's okay, or and the to me, the only way that we got here is that we've chosen the lesser of two evils so long, we've stood so close to evil for so long, that we can't fully see that it is, in fact, evil. And what gets me is we understand that in a cultural perspective, right? So people will talk about, questions of what can you watch on TV? What music can you listen to? What books can you read?
Mhm.
The bad company corrupts good morals. Who can you hang around? And no two Christians fall in exactly the same place, because there's not a cut and dry answer of, well, if you watch R-rated movies, you're going to become this. Well, that might be true for some people. It's not true for everyone. And, a there's a discernment process that I think has to happen there. But nevertheless, we recognize that point of, you stand close enough to evil, you look at evil, you listen to evil, you read evil, you hang out with evil for long enough, it's going to corrupt you. It's going to make you evil. The same is true in politics. And so if we do believe that the candidates that we have are not good representations of Jesus, but nevertheless, we need to engage in some way, we have to do so cautiously, so that we don't lose our ability to identify particularly political evil. And so that's the second reason that I think we have to be
Yeah.
cautious when we engage with the political powers.
Yeah. Just real quick, want to throw in there too is, aside from the problem of not being able to identify, there's also this other issue of, um, in choosing between these two, will we may we may be able to identify it still as evil, but we'll go through efforts to downplay, because, oh, this thing is wrong. Well, okay, sure, but over here this thing is more wrong. Well, okay, but it's still wrong, and we have a responsibility. Isaiah, this was part of the plea in the opening chapters of, call evil evil, call what's good good, practice justice, practice. That's what we're supposed to be about. Ephesians gives us this responsibility to expose darkness, say the truth, speak those things. John very heavily deals with light, darkness, speaking the truth, all those kinds of things. We still need to call evil evil and not downplay it. And I know part of why that happens is, well, if I really stop and sit with, yeah, that is evil, even though maybe this is more evil over here, yeah, that is evil, then I'm going to feel more aware of my own compromise. I'm going to feel more tension in, like, I'm admitting this is evil, but I am going to still vote anyway in this. And so we'd rather just not do that. And so there is a concern of blurring the lines so much that you just don't see the evil anymore. But there's also a very real temptation of, yeah, it's bad, but this is evil. You know, we'll make levels out of it, and don't do that. Your responsibility as an image bearer is to call good good and practice those things, and to call evil evil and not engage in those things
Yeah.
and call it what it is.
Just because it's a lesser evil, as you said, doesn't make it not
Right.
evil, which is what leads some Christians to say that both are evil enough that they can't, in good conscience,
Sure.
participate in the system by voting, for example. So, again, we're not going to talk specifically in these series about uh, telling you you should vote, you shouldn't vote, but it's an example of an application,
Yeah.
right? Of you have to discern the lesser of two evils, which isn't an easy thing to do, first off, and you have to
No.
decide which one is lesser, which is not cut and dry. So if you think that your party or your candidate is obviously the lesser of two evils, you're wrong. Like I just you, it's not that easy.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you're wrong that they are the lesser of two evils. You're wrong that in saying that it's easy, cut and dry.
Yeah.
But then you have the decision of, is my best approach forward to vote for this lesser of two evil or not to participate in the system at all, because absolute power corrupts absolutely, because we slowly lose our ability to identify evil. It's kind of like, you could go back and listen to the episode we did on the Holocaust and choiceless choices and the
Mm-hmm.
story of Tamar. And that's an example of when we use the choiceless choice of mothers in the Holocaust who were forced to choose which one of their children died. If they don't choose, both of them die. So you have three bad decisions and you have to choose which one to do, and talking about how sometimes life places us into situations where we have to make choiceless choices. And that, in essence, what we argued is morally, we're not responsible for that. It's the powerful forces of evil that have put us in those situations that are responsible for us, whatever we do when there's no good choice. And so you might want to say voting for this evil, or not engaging, which is a choice. Not doing anything is a choice. They're all a
Mm-hmm.
choice. You could say none of those is an optimal choice, but we're left with what, to my conscience, is the most morally right decision. And there's not a cut and dry
Yeah.
answer to that because of some of the things that we've laid out that
Mm-hmm.
complicate, which is why we need a theology and why we're doing this series.
Yeah.
Lastly, the reason we need to be cautious is because the greatest power we have at our disposal to change the world is the power of God's Spirit present in God's kingdom. So maybe the greatest foundation that is going to be present throughout everything that we say is the belief that at the end of the day, we don't need political power to be the church, to be image bearers of God, to fight evil and sin and darkness and brokenness, to change the world, to make the world a better place. That at the end of the day, we don't need political power because it is always going to be far, 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 far less than the power that we already have access to as citizens of God's kingdom who are indwelt by the Holy Spirit. And so our theology of a cautious approach, of why can we take a cautious approach? It's because we know that we don't need the power. And that goes back to kind of what we've said of, it's not we're not going to say it's wrong to engage with the political powers, but we're going to say we need to be cautious because there are a lot of concerns, there are a lot of pitfalls, but at the end of the day, we don't even need the power. So we can be cautious because we have access to a greater power. If we didn't, I'm not sure you could make the argument that we can be cautious. And so I wonder sometimes when Christians believe that we need political power, if they actually believe in the power that we already have through the Spirit. Because I think if you did, you would realize, well, we don't even need that power. And then I think that leads to, well, now we can take a more cautious approach and realize these possible pitfalls when we engage with those powers because we already have access to the greatest power that ultimately is going to renew the creation. So we've done a series on that as well.
Yeah. To that point, just some quick thoughts for people to maybe do a little more pursuing on, but that we don't need it, and that's very important. That if you're listening, you understand we don't need this. Jesus did not need political power to change things the way that he did. He did not need political power to do that. Um, and when we go into Acts, the disciples don't need that political power to change the shape of the places where they interact. Now, Paul will interact with political powers, but he interacts with those political powers as somebody who's a part of the kingdom. Says, I am in this power, and I'm going to keep saying these things. I'm going to keep going these places and doing this. I'm going to keep serving. I'm going to keep using that power of the Spirit in the kingdom of God. That's what I'm going to keep doing. He exercised that power that he had at his disposal when he engaged with the political powers towards the end of the book there and all of that. And I would argue that same thing is present with Joseph to some degree, that's present with Daniel, that's present with Daniel's friends as well, that in the interactions with these other powers, it's not a we need to pursue those powers. It's we're part of this thing with God. We're going to do the things God's asked us to do. And then power maybe comes from there with the powers of the world, but regardless, they're exercising the power at their disposal, the greatest power that we have.
Two quotes real quick. We in one of our episodes, I talk a little bit about N.T. Wright and Michael Bird's new book that's been out for a little while now on politics, overcoming the powers. Michael Bird, I was listening to an interview where he was talking about the book, and he says one question he asks in his college class is, would Paul have been Caesar's personal pastor? Which is an interesting question. And his point is he doesn't think there's a right or wrong answer to that, but it's complicated. And you kind of have to sit with that when you're thinking about the questions of whether or not or how we as Christians should engage in politics. He also said this, which I thought was fantastic. He says, don't, let's see, how did he put that? It's something like don't Christianize or Christianize. That's an important distinction. Caesar, so don't turn Caesar into the Christ, and don't Caesarize Christ. Don't make Jesus just this political power person that we take and build politics out of his image or something like that, which I think was another good point that illustrates what we're talking about. Anyway, we've been talking for a while now, so we'll kind of sum up here by we've talked about what our goal is, we've talked about what we believe, and now where we're going. So kind of give you an idea of some of the things that we will be doing. We're gonna on Tuesdays throughout this month, we're going to have 4 solo episodes. that Jack and I have done on our own based on the series on politics that we did here at my congregation during the summer. So we'll
Mm.
briefly run through what those will look like. So
Yeah.
Jack, you'll start with overcoming the powers.
Yeah. First lesson, and uh, Spencer and I discussed kind of the layout of these four things for his summer series thing, but he thought it would be good to deal with the unseen realm stuff, the power behind the powers, and there's a good bit to say about all of those things there. I spent, I believe, in that lesson, if I remember, spent a good amount of time in Ephesians and discussing Paul's view of the powers behind the powers, and understanding that, knowing that there's another power that's not seen is going to affect the way that we engage with those things. In the letter of Ephesians, there to the Ephesians, with the caveat of something I feel like we say on every episode, this general letter that may or may not have been written to the Ephesians. They're fighting each other as people, and Paul says that's the thing you see isn't the enemy. This is the enemy, so you need to be fighting in this way. And so understanding how we actually engage with those powers, and what that looks like from a political standpoint of, do we need to fight this way, or is there a different way that we fight? And that's ultimately what that lesson is about. You did the second lesson in the series of political issue or church issue. What was that one all about?
Yeah, so real quick, I pulled up my calendar just in case those of you listening. Jack's episode, Jack will talk about overcoming the powers on the 8th,
Mm-hmm.
October the 8th. I'll then back it up on October the 15th. We'll talk about, as Jack said, political issue or church issue. That is when our battle against the principalities, powers, and authorities in the heavenly realm, as Paul says in Ephesians, what happens when that battle moves to the political arena? In other words, that we as Christians believe that there is certain evil in the world. We look out and we see evil and we see brokenness. We believe that it exists because of the evil spiritual forces. And we believe that God has things to say about it and that we are to go to battle against it. But they've moved to the political arena. So you think of things like abortion and LGBTQ related issues, war, healthcare, poverty, all these things that have become hot button issues that
Mm-hmm.
politicians run on, that legislation is made about. And so it's not as simple as just to say, well, our battle is not against flesh and blood. That's true. But sometimes that spiritual battle moves to the political arena. And what do we do? And the way I address that is I look at how the early church addressed the same type of issues that we're doing today. And they did so not with a top-down approach, trying to gain power and make changes, but with a bottom-up approach, simply living as the church in the power of the Spirit. And I go back through history and the church fathers to make that argument that that's what the early church did.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we should do. That following Tuesday, on the 22nd, Jack, you will do our third one talking about the role of government, a little bit of Romans 13, which is probably a
Mm-hmm.
passage everybody thinks of when they hear politics. So talk a little bit about that.
A little bit of Romans 13, as well as 1 Peter 2, starting about verse 13. A lot of Peter and Paul's language is the same when it comes to government and the Christian response, particularly the words submit or subject, there being the same Greek word. So they speak about it similarly. And so, yeah, Romans 13 is home base, and talk a little bit about Peter as well. But then spend a good amount of time with Romans 12, because there is a thematic connection between those. It's more than just one chapter precedes the other. There's a flow of thought going into government and how Christians are supposed to be. And so we provide some good application, I think, towards the end, not knowing entirely what Spencer was going to talk about in the next lesson. Kind of jumped in a little bit to, if the government's role is this, what is the Christian role? And that's how that lesson ultimately ends out there. And then Spencer really dives into that with the fourth of the four lessons on, that would be the 29th, correct?
Yeah.
On loving God and neighbor, which sounds a pretty straightforward title about what you discussed. But what do you want to lay out there for that lesson?
Well, at the end of the day, what I want to argue is that the way that we apply this theology that we've been developing is in a way that loves God and loves our neighbors. So that everything that we do, and the way that we vote or choosing not to vote, the way we talk about politics and politicians, the policies that we might support or not support, we do all that in a way that loves God and loves our neighbor. And for me, it comes down to, I think too often we engage politics as Christians, we engage it selfishly. Our question is, what's going to best help my family? What's going to best help my wallet? What's going to best help my church? And I think Jesus would say, it's not wrong to have those concerns. I think he would say it's wrong for that to be the primary reason we engage politics. I think that the questions we should ask is, what's going to best help my neighbor? And most importantly, I think you see this throughout the Bible, what's going to best help the poor? What's going to best help the marginalized? What's going to best help the oppressed? What's going to best help the sick? And so I'll use me as an example. I am a white middle class guy with I do have some health issues, so I'm not the best example when it comes to healthcare or sick related things. I have, but outside of that, I don't have too many problems, right? I've got, the price of groceries and inflations and stuff affect me like everybody else, but I'm not worried about putting food on the table. I'm not oppressed or marginalized. And so when I engage, my primary question should be not what helps me, but the people that are actually struggling, that are actually living in poverty, that are actually oppressed. How do I live and engage in politics in a way that loves them first? If I'm somebody that's healthy, the question isn't, how do I engage questions related to public health in a way that works best for me, but helps those who are sick, who do have medical conditions, who do need this and that and need help. Too often we're like, well, that doesn't affect me. I don't want to help with that because I don't have that issue. And I don't think that's the way that Jesus would have us approach it. And again, it's not a cut and dry answer of how we do that. So you take something like poverty or healthcare is such a complex issue. There's not an easy, well, this is how you deal with it. No. But if you're going to make an argument for this is how we deal with it, I would say as a Christian, it better start with this is what we should do because this is what helps the poor and the sick and the marginalized and the outcast, not this is what is best for me. I guess the caveat would be unless you're the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, the sick, then maybe a little bit, but still talking about it in a way that's more concerned with neighbor than with me. It's not an I need this.
Yep.
It's my neighbor needs this.
Yeah.
Because of such and such. And then in the middle of this, I do a conversation with Jake Dobrins, who we've had on the podcast before, to talk about his book about AI in church and ministry. And so if you haven't seen that episode, if you haven't bought his book, I would encourage you to do that as well. But we do a little bit of implication and application of this theology. So what we try to do is address some of the major pushback against the theology that we're laying out and talk about that a little bit more. The primary one being things that have to do with the oppressed and the marginalized, liberation theology. That is, if you have groups of people that are being harmed or oppressed because of government and because of policies. So we talk about, the obvious are like slavery and the civil rights movement. You have people that are being harmed by government policies. And today you could talk about things relating to poverty and healthcare that you could have people are going to be harmed by certain policies. And so the pushback is, if you're saying not to engage in government very much, or to be very, very cautious about it, what do you say to the people who are like, well, I'm being harmed because of government, and yet you're saying don't engage in government, or being cautious about engaging in government, which is a very strong pushback. So we talk about that and try to strike the balance of, okay, so how do we maintain this cautious approach and also stand with the poor and the outcast and the marginalized, as Jesus did? Because if we're going to stand with them at some point, we're going to have to get a little bit of political, because there's the potential of them being harmed by politics and by government and by policies. And so we try to talk a little bit about the implications of this theology and address some of the pushbacks in that episode. So my encouragement would be, if you listen to this or any of the other episodes and you're just like, well, we don't know what we're talking about because of X, Y, and Z, make sure to listen to that episode, because we try to address some of the pushback that comes with what we're arguing and explain where we fall on some of those, I think, good and rightly pointed out potential problems with the theology that we're setting forth. But that's where we'll be going throughout the rest of this month.
Yeah, there you go. That's what to expect this month as far as lessons go, and don't forget there'll be some articles sprinkled throughout there as well about these things. And yeah, be sure to check those out. Be sure to share those things. Be sure to let us know how you feel about all of those things. You can email us at strongchurchministries@gmail.com. You can reach out to us on our Facebook page, or if you are friends with us personally, you can reach out to us that way as well. And you can get a hold of Spencer just about pretty well anywhere, with the understanding that he's traveling a bunch this month, and then when he's back, I'm traveling. So we're going to be all over the place. We're not dodging the political stuff, posting it and then running away. But we'll be have some understanding there if you're trying to reach out to us that we may be maybe traveling a little bit, but we'll get back to you as best we can. And maybe at the end of all these things, do some kind of episode if there's enough buzz about people's comments and thoughts on different things. You know, who knows? Maybe there's another episode to be born out of all of this. But hope you check this out and enjoy these things, and look forward to this month on thinking theologically about politics. But that's this episode. I'm Jack. That's Spencer. We'll see you next time.